Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Craig Foyle, and I would like to welcome you to the Joint Consultancy Group and Food and Drink Group webinar on CDM 2015, Significant Changes and Simple Solutions. The webinar will consist of a presentation and then a question and answer session. If you have any questions, please send these in throughout the presentation, but use the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, but if we do run out of time at the end of the webinar, we will endeavour to answer the questions afterwards and upload them onto the respective group websites. My involvement within CDM has been over 20 years in terms of construction, and my main focus areas are engineering construction and minor civil construction projects, and I work in the food and drink, chemical and pharmaceutical sectors. From an IOSH perspective, I chair the IOSH Consultancy Group, sit on IOSH Council, and also on the committee for IOSH Humber. I'm joined today by Raymond Bone. Raymond's been involved in civil construction projects for over 25 years, working in civil engineering and construction management. And Ray is the Vice Chair of Consultancy Group and the Vice Chair of IOSH Humber. And I'm now going to hand you over to Ray to outline the history of the CDM regulations.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everyone. The history of the CDM regulations: the European Directive 92/57 EEC, Temporary or Mobile Construction Sites Directive, was introduced into the UK. Was then made into the CDM 1994 regulations, Construction Design and Management 1994 regulations, which introduced a role of a planning supervisor. That was revised, and the new regulations CDM 2007 was introduced, and that introduced the role there of the CDM coordinator. And as I'm all sure you're fully aware, in CDM 2015, the CDM coordinator role was replaced with the new role of principal designer. The reason for these changes is an attempt by the UK to try to ensure compliance with the requirements of the 92/57 Temporary or Mobile Construction Sites Directive. Some of the key changes this introduced is the role of the CDM coordinator had been removed and replaced with the new role of the principal designer. The appointment will be required where more than one contractor will be working at any one time. So where there is one contractor, that's a normal CDM project. Where there is more than one contractor, the project will need to be appointed. The contractor will need to be appointed. The CDM Approved Code of Practice, Managing Health and Safety in Construction L144, has been replaced now with the Tailored Guidance. So the key changes regarding the principal designer. In real terms, the role of the principal designer is fundamentally similar to the CDM coordinator from 2007 regulations, as in the pre-construction phase. But there is a serious significant exemption. Apart from assisting the client with preparation of the pre-construction information, the principal designer is not specifically required to give advice and guidance to the client. A further key change is domestic clients. The exemption for the domestic client has been removed. General householders have now duties under CDM 2015. These duties can be transferred to the principal contractor or principal designer. A transitional period was introduced in April 6, 2015. CDM coordinators who were already appointed on projects which commenced before the 6th of April 2015 were able to remain in the post for 6 months or to the end of the project, whichever was the earlier. Any existing F10 notifications should have been updated to reflect the appointment of the principal designer, as the role of the CDMC is no longer applicable. you can see the Managing Health and Safety in Construction CDM 2007 guidance. That's now been replaced with Managing Health and Safety in Construction Guidance Document L153 and the statutory instrument number 51, which was made on the 22nd of January 2015, laid before Parliament on the 29th of January 2015, and indeed came into force on the 6th of April 2015. CRTB have produced a number of guidance documents, 6 in total, 1 for each representative duty holder, 1 for clients, principal designer, principal contractor, contractor, designer and workers. And these are all available online.
So one of the important changes to CDM 2015 related to competence criteria. With CDM 2007, in Appendix 4 of the approved Code of Practice, there were specific requirements for the standards that needed to be achieved and what evidence had to be demonstrated for duty holders to demonstrate competence. And what the HSE are relying now are the requirements set out in the Health and Safety at Work Act. Quoting the Act, the provision of such information, instruction, training and supervision as is necessary to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety at work of employees. There are certain third-party schemes out there from a competence point of view for contractors, and SSIP stands for Safety Schemes in Procurement, and third-party organisations are able to assist with the competence assessment process. One thing that we've found out is to question ourselves, is this enough? The idea is that we can rely on potential third-party organisations to assess the competency. What we are suggesting is that we have checks in place to ensure that the appropriate information is being requested and that specific information for projects is determined. What I've put on this next slide here are some checks we need to consider when looking at third-party assessments, particularly if they're using the safety schemes in procurement. The idea is that you're not having to request the information again that's already been requested from others. But things to look out for: check the company is accredited. There are a number of accreditation schemes out there, and there are abilities for some people in these schemes to be member-onlys, or in my experience, we've also found where contractor organisations may have been suspended, but if you're not aware of that, then it's something which you would not want these people on site without that knowledge. Another thing to do is to review the scope of accreditation, because in some situations the contractors determine the scope of their accreditation excuse me, and so it's important to make sure that the work that the contractor is saying they're going to cover is actually what has been assessed by others. So it is important to review sample documentation. You want to see examples of documentation related to projects similar to the ones that you've got. Another thing to consider is also the Stage 2 assessment. In addition to contractors and organisations having the relevant documentation procedures, you want to know that they've actually practiced this work in real life, and you can see real examples of how they've completed, whether it be pre-construction information, construction phase plans, risk assessments, method statements, all areas that are applicable as part of the assessment process. Another thing to consider when reviewing contractor or any duty holder competence is also to review the enforcement pages for notices and prosecutions, which are on the HSE website. They split these down into up to 5 years or over 5 years for enforcement notices, but also on the prosecutions databases. Another thing I'm recommending also is that you also need to record the date that you do these checks, because with live schemes where it's internet access to see if an organisation is accredited, or if you look at the HSE websites, it's important to record the date that you do these checks in case that data changes. And what we've done is Just a simple example there of a spreadsheet that would show you an organisation, the third-party accreditation. If they have third-party accreditation, you can list down the name of the body, the expiry date of that certification, the certificate number, and the scope. At this stage, from a document review, you can decide whether you need further assessment is required, yes or no. If you do need further assessment, then you can decide what to do, how you're going to do it. The Appendix 4 of CDM 2007 ACOP had a very useful question set that could be used, and that information is still there, but it's been taken out of the guidance for CDM 2015. And on the right-hand column, you can see we've got HSE enforcement check. The idea is there that the date that you do those checks, you put in there. And from my personal perspective, I mark them green if they are clear. And if there are any concerns in the example there, I just mark the text as red, and it gives you the driver to do further investigation. I'm not suggesting that you do not use anybody because they've had previous interaction with HSE, but certainly you should ask questions to understand what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and what an organisation has done to prevent such a recurrence happening again. So an important change to the notification requirements. They look similar until you read the print. So the notification threshold has changed. Work lasting more than 30 working days and have more than 20 workers working simultaneously at any one time on site. So that's both of those. Or as before, the project exceeds 500 person days. The number of notifications submitted to HSE will reduce on small to medium sized projects. However, please be aware that the regulations apply whether a project is notifiable or not. A very common misconception over CDM 1994 and CDM 2007 was if it's not notifiable, then you don't have to do anything. And it's one of the most common problems which I come across in terms of misunderstanding of the regulations. As Ray mentioned earlier on, we have two types of projects. So irrespective of size or duration, we have projects with one contractor, or we have projects that involve or potentially may involve more than one contractor at any one time. And so what we have next is just some examples of whether projects become notifiable or not. So in this example here, a contractor has been awarded a contract to rewire part of a building and no other trades are required to do any work. The first question would be, does this count as construction? This seminar is based on the main changes with CDM 2015, but in this situation we are putting services and affixing them to structures, therefore we decide that construction does apply. So the project will require only 2 people and it is anticipated the work will take 6 weeks. So looking at this, 5 working days per week times 6 weeks is 30 working days. If we look at it differently, 2 people times 5 days times 6 weeks is 60 person days. Therefore, notification is not required because it's less than 500 person days or 30 construction days, but more than 20 people on site. Pre-construction information would be required, and a construction phase plan is required because the CDM regulations 2015 require a construction phase plan for all work. And one thing just to point out is when you're looking at the number of working days, it's actual construction days. So if your working week is 5 days a week, you would only multiply that by 5. It depends on how many days you are working. And then down at the bottom, a principal designer and a principal contractor are not required if it's a single contractor project. And a health and safety file is not required according to the regulations. However, we are suggesting that this would be good practice because there may be important information to update those in charge of the structure. Oops, there you go. Okay, our second example is where there's more than one contractor and we're still saying it's not notifiable. So we have capital approval to extend our current buildings. The project is expected to require 10 people from various contractors working for 6 weeks. So the requirements, 5 working days per week times 6 weeks is 30 working days. 10 people times 5 days times 6 weeks equals 300 person days. So notification is still not required. We've got less than 500 person days or less than 30 days and 20 people. So pre-construction information is required. A construction phase plan is required. And because we have more than one contractor, we need a principal designer and we need a principal contractor, and they must be appointed in writing. In addition, because we have more than one contractor, a health and safety file is also required, and we'll go through the duty holder requirements in a bit. Okay, so our third example, greater than one contractor and notifiable. So we have capital approval to install a new production line. The project is expected to require 15 people from 5 contractors working for 20 weeks. So we have 5 working days per week times 20 weeks, 100 working days, and 15 people times 5 days times 20 weeks is 1,500 person days. So with CDM 2007, most often for the projects I've always dealt with, a project was notifiable because it was more than 30 days on site. We have to now look at the number of person days closely to consider the impact of notification with the regulations with CDM 2015. So the action required, notification is required because we have greater than 500 person days and 100 working days, but that's less than 20 people. Pre-construction information is required, construction phase plan is required, principal designer and principal contractor must again be appointed in writing, and the health and safety file is required as well. Okay, I'm going to hand you over to Ray to go through the principal duty holders.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So the first duty holder we're going to look at is the client. So a client's duties for all projects, they are to make sure that suitable arrangements for managing a project are in place, and this includes appoint or engage people and organisations that have sufficient health and safety skills, knowledge and experience, which will enable them to carry out the work they have to do and that they are adequately resourced to do so. Ensure that all appointments are made early enough to enable those appointed to carry out their duties effectively. Make suitable arrangements for managing the project and to ensure that they remain in place and are reviewed throughout the project so that construction works can be carried out safely and without risks to persons' health. Make sure that sufficient time and resources have been allocated for each stage of the project. This will include design, preparation for starting on site, and the construction activities itself. They must be satisfied that suitable welfare facilities have been provided by contractors, or in some instances the client can provide these themselves, from the start and throughout of the construction phase. They must provide pre-construction information as soon as this is practicable to every designer and contractor which they appoint, so that they can comply with their own duties. They must ensure that before the construction phase commences, that a suitable construction phase plan is drawn up by the contractor or principal contractor where the project is involving more than one contractor. Where it's likely that there may be more than one contractor working on a project at any given time, the client must also ensure that a principal designer is appointed in writing to coordinate the pre-construction phase. This would be in accordance with Regulation 5.1a. A principal contractor is appointed in writing also, as soon as practicable, to coordinate the construction phase and ensure that the principal designer and principal contractor carry out their duties. And this can be taken through various measures such as site meetings, inspections, safety tours, etc. Whichever measure is implemented, I suggest that these are recorded and archived. It is the client's responsibility to ensure that an F10 notification is submitted to the HSE where the project is notifiable. However, this can now be submitted on behalf of the client. The regulations mostly require the client to ensure that a number of requirements are met rather than doing everything themselves. Okay, the next duty holder is the principal designer. So this is the new role which was introduced in CDM 2015. Principal designers are designers appointed by the client in projects involving more than one contractor. They can be an organisation or an individual, as long as they have the sufficient knowledge, experience and ability to carry out the role to which they have been employed. They must plan, manage, monitor and coordinate health and safety in the pre-construction phase of a project. This would include identifying, eliminating and/or controlling foreseeable risks, and ensuring designers carry out their duties. They need to prepare and provide relevant information to other duty holders. Coordinate arrangements for health and safety during the design and planning pre-construction phases. Liaise with the principal contractor for the duration of their appointment and share relevant health and safety information. We say for the duration of their appointment, as the principal designer can withdraw their duties on completion of the pre-construction phase. The principal designer must assist the client in the provision of pre-construction information. However, please note that under the CDM 2015 regulations, the principal designer is not legally required to provide advice to the client. However, this was a specific duty set on the CDM coordinator under CDM 2007. Principal contractor is the next duty holder. Principal contractors are contractors appointed by the client to coordinate the construction phase of a project where it would involve more than one contractor. They too need to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate the construction phase of a project. To do this, it would include liaising with the client and principal designer, preparing the construction phase plan, organising, cooperating between contractors and coordinating the work, for instance, site meetings, programme reviews, etc. Additional duties on principal contractors also includes suitable site inductions are undertaken. Reasonable steps are taken to prevent unauthorised access, i.e. security of the site or the CDM area. Workers are consulted and engaged in securing their health and safety. Welfare facilities are provided and maintained. And liaise with the principal designer for the duration of their appointment and share relevant health and safety information. Moving on to the designer. Designers are those who, as part of a business, prepare or modify designs for a building, a product or a system relating to construction work or activities. When preparing or modifying designs to eliminate, reduce or control foreseeable risks that may arise during construction and the maintenance and use of a building once it has been built, and provide information to other members of the project team to help them fulfill their duties. Principal designers and designers have to comply or adhere to the principles of prevention. Contractors. Contractors are those who do the actual construction work and can be either an individual or again a company. They too need to plan, manage and monitor construction work under their control so that it's carried out without risks to health and safety. For those projects involving more than one contractor, they must coordinate their activities with others who are in the project team. In particular, comply with directions given to them by the principal contractor. For single contractor projects, they need to prepare a construction phase plan. So things to consider. Until the client has appointed a principal designer and a principal contractor, where this is applicable, more than one contractor projects, they will then automatically inherit the duties of each of the above duty holders under the regulations. So making them appointments in writing is critical. Once appointed, the principal designer and principal contractor may carry out their duties and may be able to give further advice to the client. On projects with only one contractor, they, that is the contractor, should advise the client on how they can assist them with their duties, where this is appropriate. And remember, appointment is required as soon as is practicable. Thank you.
So what we've started to do then now is to look at some of the things that have to be done. We've gone through what's required and what the duty holder excuse me, requirements are, but now we need to make sure that when pre-construction information is provided, it's provided in a timely fashion. And for those of you that can remember back to 1994, the document might have been called a pre-tender health and safety plan, but the information should be there to give specific information about a site, details about the project. So as you can see on the slide there, project description, project directory, who else is involved, who are the client, designers, principal designers, contractors work on a project. We need to think about client considerations and management requirements. So what specifically is required to work on a particular site to meet the client requirements. In addition to health and safety, it's also environmental restrictions and on-site risks, so safety hazards, health hazards, and also environmental hazards, and significant design and construction hazards. So at this stage, an early stage of a project, there should be the thought process of what are the issues that are going to be present on the site, what issues will the project bring to the site, and when we're looking at design risk mitigation, we're not just thinking about the safety of those doing the construction work, it's also thinking about what the workplace is going to be used with after the construction phase is finished. And we also need to think about maintenance, and also at the end of the life of a structure, sometimes we have to consider any potential impacts during demolition or dismantling. And then another key point is to list what the health and safety requirements are. Now, at this stage in pre-construction, we've got significant design assumptions, but it's also important in pre-construction information to highlight what information will be expected to go into a health and safety file. And this information shouldn't be just submitted at the end of a project, it's information that should be submitted as a project progresses. There's been lots of debate over the construction phase plan template. What should it be? How big should it be? And on simple projects where you have a single contractor doing construction work, it does not have to be multiple pages. And the HSE have even produced an information leaflet on this. The web link to that address is on the slide, and it can be very, very simple. Names and addresses of the client, what is the task that's being done, the key dates, covering off welfare facilities, who else is on site, who the principal contractor is, if that's applicable, and how you keep people on site updated as the project progresses. In addition, the next part are the key areas where the HSE have identified significant issues in construction. So falls from height, collapse of excavations, collapse of structures, exposure to building dusts, exposure to asbestos activities, or workers requiring supervision, electricity, and risk to members of the public, the client, and others. Because it is important when a project is being planned to consider the impact on others that may be affected by your activities, as well as the work that you may be doing specifically yourself as a contractor. I have seen many different types of templates already since April, and I would suggest that it's got to be based on the size and complexity of a project. We could argue a very detailed risk assessment and method statement could be sufficient to meet the requirements. I would just suggest that the core requirements in the HSE template are used even on really small projects. And then the health and safety file. We've said already that at the moment It's only when there's more than one contractor that the health and safety file must be prepared. It's the role of the principal designer to commence the health and safety file. However, where their appointment does not last to the end of a project, they would hand that over to the client, who should then pass that on to the principal contractor to continue the development. We've already said that we strongly advise that the health and safety file is prepared, even for single contractor projects, to allow people to manage their buildings and structures correctly. So what should the client do with the health and safety file? They should keep it. They should make it safe, keep it safe, and make it available to anyone who may need it in the future, and explain the purpose of it. It must be updated wherever necessary. And when the interest in the structure is no longer acquired, the file must be passed on to those acquiring it. And the client should ensure that the file is being prepared as the project progresses. Very often in projects, health and safety files are either unavailable or not there at all, and it's something which it is important to allow people to be able to plan, manage and protect their people working on a project. We've covered the technical aspects of the regulations. What we want to do now is to go through some discussion points, and I can also see that we have quite a lot of questions to go through. So we'll go through these the discussion points first, and then we'll look at the questions. So in terms of factory shutdowns, the common question I am asked is a factory shutdown, a maintenance shutdown, does it count as a CDM project? And from my interpretation, it does, because certainly for the people that I work for, because we are dealing with structures, we're dealing with equipment that is fixed to a structures. We may be dismantling, we may be erecting, every project is different, but a factory shutdown, if you work through the notification requirements, the ones I do with are notifiable projects. Sometimes it may be 100, 200 people on site per day. Multiply that by day shifts and night shifts, and the good news about following these requirements is that you're planning, you're managing, you're monitoring, you're cooperating, you're coordinating. It's good safety or good project safety management to follow the requirements of the regulations. And I found a lot of organisations had the required systems in place for managing the construction work. It's just accepting in the first place that the work is classed as construction. Okay. So next one, I'm going to hand over to Ray to talk about term maintenance contracts.
Thank you, Craig. So some examples of term maintenance contracts, and I can see this will answer one or two of the questions that's popped in as well. If we look at some term maintenance contracts, and I'll give you some examples. So 3-year term maintenance contract for replacement of bathrooms in local authority council housing, or replacement of kitchens, replacement of boiler systems, central heating systems, etc. This can be done under a term maintenance contract, a 3-4 year contract, with a review of extending them. My advice on this type of work is it's not practicable to issue a construction phase plan on behalf of the contractor, a principal contractor, for every one of these properties or dwellings. What my advice is on there is that we create one construction phase plan which is submitted to the client and is reviewed on an annual basis, and each property is then made more specific for that construction phase plan via the on-site risk assessments and method statements. So the on-site risk assessments and method statements which have to be carried out in any event would then support the submitted annual construction phase plan, which would cover, in my opinion, term maintenance contracts. Okay, another point we have on there which I'll look at is the client advisor role. It's not a legal duty role mentioned in the CDM regulations, but one which is becoming quite popular. It's getting more mention as the time develops. In some aspects, the old CDM coordinator has undertook this role. They have the skills, knowledge and expertise, or can demonstrate that quite adequately to clients. So they're providing this role to a client. they're advising the client on the type of information which should be inserted into the pre-construction information. They tend to look at the pre-construction information and advise the client on its adequacy and its content. They will still review a construction phase plan, although there is no legal requirement for that under the 2015 regulations, but they will still review and advise the client on the adequacy of the construction phase plan, in particular where it's been mentioned in CDM regarding welfare and suitable and sufficient measures, site induction, etc. So the client advisor role is quite an important role, and as I've said, it's becoming more and more popular, and it's a good role for clients to view. Okay, over to Craig now. We'll cover short duration and simple projects.
So, I mean, from the work I do in the food and drink industry, it's one of the most common areas where we have one or two contractors doing a very small project. It may be a day, 2 days, 3 days, and all the time we're being questioned at the moment of, do I still need to have a construction phase plan? And the answer is yes, you do. But you've seen in the example we gave you from the HSE that can be a single side of A4, but it just needs to contain the relevant information and be proportionate to the level of risk. So it's a case of have the systems in place, but from a client perspective, it's making sure that instead of just asking for risk assessments and method statements, it will be the case of asking for risk assessments, method statements, construction phase plan. However, if there is more than one contractor, which is for a lot of projects, there still does need to be a principal contractor appointed. And on very small projects, we're finding that some contractors don't want to take on the role of principal contractor. So it kind of leads more towards the client taking on that responsibility if there are no others to appoint, because we've said earlier on, it's the client's responsibility to ensure that duty holders are appointed in a timely fashion. The main thing to do is just to remind everybody to keep it very, very simple and not have too lengthy documents, too many words, because it detracts from the real nature of who's on site, how are they communicating, who can be harmed, how can they be harmed, and what can we do to save them from being harmed. I'm just going to go on to the bottom bullet before handing back to Ray. Regarding their resource and competence, it is a requirement for all duty holders to be able to demonstrate their competence. And CDM 2007 brought about the aspect of anybody presenting themselves to be any of the duty holders under CDM is self-declaring competence, even though the client would still do the checks to make sure that they were. If clients are taking on more responsibility, they're becoming the principal designer, they're becoming the principal contractor, they too should be able to demonstrate that they have the competencies for doing the various aspects to meet the requirements for CDM. In addition, another big thing that I find is it's competence and resource. Now, resource means people need to give themselves not just equipment, but it's also time. Do you have time to fulfill that role? If you are the principal designer or the principal contractor, to do the cooperation and the coordination properly. So that's a key aspect that needs to be done. And so clients should question themselves, should record that with a client, it may be that you have a collective competence. You might not have one individual with all the skills required, but you've got the safety competencies, the engineering competencies, the construction competencies that as an organization could be brought together to meet that requirement. Okay, Ray will now go through erection of marquees.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So the erection of marquees for such events such as fetes, open days, displays, etc. never used to fall under the requirements of CDM 2007. However, this is a specific requirement under the CDM Regulation 2015. So in any events where marquees are to be erected, CDM will apply, again with the same principles. So if there's numerous marquees being erected by different contractors or from different organisations, then this would have to be viewed as more than one contractor, and therefore pre-construction information would need to be sent to each of the designers, and a construction phase plan to come back, a principal contractor appointed to plan, manage and organise such events. So unfortunately now the erection of marquees for any such events does fall under CDM 2015, and as such CDM 2015 imposes them requirements.
Okay, so just to go through one recent prosecution and then we'll go on to the questions. So this case regarded a company called Cheshire Care Limited, and it highlights the importance of getting it right. They were a care-based provider engaged in construction works, and they were fined after they've admitted unsafe working practices, including failing to remove asbestos materials from old buildings before demolition work. The company, Cheshire Care Limited, was acting as the client for the project, but it had failed to appoint a principal contractor or CDM coordinator in writing as was required. Now, this case was initially brought up under the CDM 2007 regulations, but when I go through the failings and the fines, it's relevant for where we are now. So they admitted multiple failures of CDM 2007, and they were fined a total of £35,000 and ordered to pay costs of £1,321.60. But they were fined £5,000 for failing to appoint a CDM coordinator as the client, so that they were the client and they took on that role and did not appoint themselves. They failed to notify the construction project to the Health and Safety Executive, as they should have done, and that was another £5,000. Failure to appoint a principal contractor in writing, as they were the client, another £5,000. Failure to start construction phase as the client by not ensuring the principal contractor had prepared a construction phase plan, another £5,000. And then failure to plan, manage and monitor the construction phase, being the principal contractor, another £15,000. So it's a good example of how we can be responsible for lots of different parts of the regulations. Failing to appoint can have a significant fine just for that, and in this case it was failure to appoint in the various duty holders, and there was a fine for each. So it's worth noting that going forward. So what we're going to try and do now is go through some of the questions. So Ray's got one open, so I'll let you go through it, Ray.
Okay, so Marge Rees has asked a question. Can you clarify when a principal designer is required for projects? The answer is any project which requires more than one contractor, and that could be a contractor who's employing a subcontractor, then the appointment for a principal designer is then required. So as soon as a principal contractor is required on a project where there is more than one contractor, then the appointment for a principal designer is also required. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a question from IOSH Events. How will house builders know they have duties? I won't read it all out. It's the responsibility of contractors or principal contractors to make sure that a domestic client is aware of their duties, and the designers, whether they be architects that are working for a domestic client. So I appreciate it's a difficult question. How will they not know what they don't know? But it's those working in construction which should give that advice.
Okay, next question is from Emily Brimson, who's asking if there is one contractor but their subcontractor scaffolding company, for example, how does this fit with needing a principal designer and principal contractor? Well, if there's one contractor and they still subcontract in a scaffold erection company, that is more than one contractor, it's a subcontractor. Therefore, the requirements to appoint a principal contractor is met. Therefore, that has to be made in writing, and then a principal designer would subsequently need to be appointed also.
Okay, Philip Pointer, is the principal designer radically different from the CDM coordinator because the principal designer is now responsible for planning, managing and monitoring the pre-construction phase, which was not a CDMC duty? The CDM coordinator before had significant responsibility for the communication and cooperation during the the pre-construction phase, but then that also carried on throughout the project. So the principal designer takes on what was largely the part of the CDM coordinator, but for the pre-construction phase, or as long as the design is ongoing. So there are similarities, but it's not totally different. Okay, on to Ray.
Okay, Mike Stevens has asked, does CDM apply to all works of engineering construction? Yes, if all construction work activities are covered under the definition of construction within CDM 2015. So yes, all works involving engineering construction is applicable under CDM 2015.
Another one, can we appoint the organisations previously engaged as a CDM coordinator to be appointed as the principal designer? The answer is yes, as long as the CDM coordinator, as was, can demonstrate their competence as a designer. There's guidance out there as to what makes a principal designer competent, but it's the qualifications and the experience, and in a lot of the guidance I've seen even goes towards looking at chartered engineers as well. So it's not just a case of you were a CDMC before, so you are now automatically a principal designer now. The competencies are different.
Okay, one more for me. Val Metzchak 2. Are you expected to obtain pre-construction information for a small job such as painting a door under the definition of the regulations? That's classed as construction activity. Therefore, you are expected to receive pre-construction information. However, don't get too confused by this. It would be the amount of pre-construction information and the detail would be applicable to the size of the works being undertaken. So for such a small activity as painting a door, it would be absolute basic information that would need to be provided to the contractor who's actually painting the door. But yes, it is still a requirement for this to be sent and received by the contractor.
I have a question from Alistair Barrett, where people are privately working. The question is about professional indemnity insurance, and I'm just reading through the question there. Depending on the size of project, what I would suggest you do is you do need to talk to an insurer and discuss the levels of cover required for your organisation. Professional indemnity insurance is different to employer liability and public liability, in that it's your current insurer of the day that is responsible for any past claims that come up. So when going for professional indemnity insurance, you need to make sure that you advise the insurers of the previous work that you may have done. Just while Ray's finding one, is a safety plan required for very minor work such as changing a tap washer? I would like to suggest the answer is no. Because in terms of the definition of construction, so that would and could be classified as a minor maintenance activity.
Okay, I've got one from Steve May. This is the last question for me. And Steve saying, hi Craig and Ray, thank you both for presenting this. I wonder, could you say something about the requirement that a principal contractor must be a contractor and a principal designer to be a designer? If clients are considering taking on these roles, they should be aware of the requirements. I totally agree with you, Steve. My comments on that is that a principal contractor has to have the skills, knowledge and experience to be able to manage not only himself but other contractors appointed. The client needs to ensure that they're competent to do that, hence the competence checks. The principal designer may help with this, but the client's advisor would certainly be help with that. So yes, that answers that question. And the principal designer to be a designer, the regulations quite clearly stipulate that to be a principal designer, you must have a qualification or knowledge, experience, etc. within a design area to which the project is applicable. So it must be. So for highways, if you're for existence, if you're looking at a project for civil engineering or highways, then you would be expected to have a qualification within that area of the project to which is going to be undertaken. Thank you.
Okay, another question. I won't give the name on this one. If a contractor is carrying out the client duties, for example, submitting the F10 and appointment of all of the duty holders on the client's behalf, should they be formally appointed in writing? I would just be very careful with this. It's very clear what the client's responsibilities are. They need to appoint the principal designer where applicable, the principal contractor where applicable. The F10 can be done by anybody, but when the F10 form is submitted, the person that submits the F10 electronically has to declare that the client is aware of their duties. With regards to a third party appointing other duty holders, I would suggest that that's not the client then appointing the appropriate person. There used to be the ability for a client's agent in CDM 1994, but that was revoked in 2007. So I would suggest that the client does appoint the relevant duty holders directly. And if the contractor is carrying out the other client duties like monitoring, for example, I would certainly want the contractor to be in very close communication with the client so they are aware of where things are and how compliant it is. But it's just something to be mindful of. Okay, just going for one more. We've kind of covered this one already. Someone's asked if we're going to cover CDM in the entertainment and events industry, where CDM applies to all construction work, including marquees. We've covered marquees, and it's all structures. So I think I'm hoping that from the question and answer set so far in the presentation that all work that's classified as construction, the regulations apply to everything, irrespective of whichever industry that they may be in. Just looking for a couple more if I can. Oh, okay, we're getting some interesting questions. At a major event where there are multiple sites within an overall site, how would this be handled? So if we look at it, it can be looked in a couple of ways. You may have a significant construction site that involves a multiplex cinema, a shopping centre, shops, residential houses. Where possible, it would be nice to have one single principal contractor. However, in many situations, it's not possible. In a lot of the situations I deal with, there will be a large site. It can be a food and drink production site, and there may be a principal contractor for some civil works outside. There may be a principal contractor for a machinery installation in one part of a factory, and another principal contractor elsewhere for equipment removal, for example. In these situations, they can be separate projects with separate notifications and separate principal designers and separate principal contractors. But what we should do is consider the potential impact between the respective construction projects and the client's activities. And a common way we can get around this is to have everyone has their weekly planning meetings where they're looking at the next 10 days ahead, as well as their daily get-togethers for their respective projects. But on a regular basis, maybe weekly or more for some type of sites, you'll get the respective principal contractors together with the drawing of the site down, and everyone can just explain the key issues associated with their work for a set period. It may be that somebody has a mobile crane which will block off the main transport route onto a site in 3 weeks' time. People get that information and they can plan their projects accordingly. But we have to make sure that shared areas are still managed. So if it's a living production facility that's got a number of construction projects on it, then in these cases the client would still retain control of the roads, footpaths, and maybe welfare facilities and other areas. If we find that the roadways are part of the construction areas, then it will be a case of very clear who is responsible for maintaining, but also thinking about site security. How are we stopping people from being able to walk into a construction area? And if we take a really small construction project where you might literally have a plumber putting in an amount of pipe, they're not going to fence the whole factory off. There may be localized barriers there just while that work's being done. And those barriers might move along with the individuals in a set day. And so CDM doesn't require you to landlock or fully lock down a site. We've got to prevent people from harm from construction work that are not involved in it.
Okay, final question then for today's session, and thank you very much to everybody who's logged in. Emily Brimson, your question, where is the definition of construction work in the regulations? Well, the guidance document L153 sets out on page 10, regulation 2, quite clearly down towards the bottom of the page, and it says construction site includes any place where construction work is being carried out, etc. And the final point on the bottom of page 10, construction work means the carrying out of any building, civil engineering or engineering construction work, and it includes, and I shan't read those out, but it includes on page 11 subsections A to E. But it says it does not include the exploration for or extraction of mineral resources or proprietary activities carried out in a place where such exploration or extraction is carried out. So to answer that question, it's regulation 2 in the L153 guidance document, page 10 and page 11. Thank you.
Okay, so unfortunately we have run out of time. We still have a number of questions that need to be answered. We will tackle all of these and put some responses down to, and as I said, we'll put them on the respective food and drink and consultancy group websites for that response. So from my perspective, from a consultancy group, I'd like to thank Ray for his help and support on this, but also we have had a note from Paul Fenner from Food and Drink Group saying thank you to us. Thank you, Paul. But it's really good that the two groups can work together. It spreads the exposure in terms of people being made aware. But food and drink, consultancy, construction, whatever group you may be, the regulations do span across away from the construction side. So I really hope this has been of use for you, and if anybody needs anything else, we'll make sure at the bottom of the presentation that there are some contact details should you have any further questions. Thank you very much.